Hello, so we're doing the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the closest that the world has ever gotten to all-out nuclear war. And the president who had to make the decision of what to do during the showdown between the Soviet Union and the United States, both heavily armed with nuclear warheads, was John F. Kennedy. So the question today is, did John F. Kennedy do the right thing during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And you can think of it as from two standpoints, which is that John F. Kennedy was a cool head who made rational decisions during a time of intense stress. You could also come at this from another standpoint, which is that John F. Kennedy was an untested and reckless president who brought us very, very close to all-out nuclear war, which would have devastated the world. Well, certainly the Soviet Union and the United States. So what you have to do is figure out whether he did the right thing, and there's the question. Did JFK do the right thing during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Right. So you are going to make up your mind, and I am going to read Joy Hakim's narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Being president isn't easy. The small island of Cuba near Florida had terrible problems. Its government was corrupt. Criminals were making fortunes on the island, and most Cubans were very poor. So when Fidel Castro came along and took charge in 1959, many Cubans and Americans were hopeful. But when they learned that Castro was a communist, a Marxist, Leninist, Soviet communist, most stopped cheering. Castro did clean up much of the corruption in Cuba, improve the schools, and better race relations, as in he made them race relations better. But he was a dictator. The Cuban people were not free to oppose him or his ideas. That's a photo with him, and that's Fidel Castro, and that's Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. But he was a dictator. Meant the Cuban people were not free to oppose him or his ideas. Many Cubans fled Cuba for the United States. They didn't intend to stay here. They wanted to go back to their own country and overthrow Castro. Most Americans would have liked that. The idea of a communist nation with ties to Russia sitting 90 miles off the coast of the United States made people in this country very nervous. In fact, these Cubans are fleeing Cuba for the United States. We've been reading about it in Refugee. That was one of the people who fled Cuba for the United States. As soon as John F. Kennedy became president, he learned that the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, had been secretly training Cuban refugees as warriors and planning to land them on the island. The CIA experts said that the Cuban people would then rise up, join the invaders, and throw out dictator Castro. President Kennedy didn't want to seem soft on communism. No president, no US president did. After Joseph McCarthy, no one did. He told the CIA to go ahead. The invasion at a place called the Bay of Pigs, right here, launched from here by the CIA, was a fiasco, which means it was a flop, fizzle, bomb, washout, dud, botch. So this is Cuba. Nothing worked right. The invaders were captured. The Cuban people didn't rise up. America and Kennedy looked foolish. The young president took all the blame himself. There is an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan, he said. I am the responsible officer in this government, he added. The American people admired his honesty. His ratings in the popularity polls soared. But around the world, people wondered, is he strong enough to be president? Russia's leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was sure he wasn't. It seemed a good time to bully the United States. Premier Khrushchev decided to do something bold, and Khrushchev was a bully, and he was a little uncertain. Now this is a bit of a blurry photograph because the photograph I took of the book wasn't very good, but this is an actual intelligence photograph of missile sites in Cuba that was used as evidence to take action against the Soviet Union. It was good. And this is from thousands and thousands of feet up in the air. The U-2 spy planes were amazing at taking really good photographs from a long way away. Anyway, so Khrushchev decided to do something bold. He decided to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. They would be aimed right at America's most important cities and military targets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture of how many targets the Soviets, if they installed missiles in Cuba, could have hit. Well, New York would have been completely vulnerable, as you can see, and they could have hit targets as far away as San Francisco and Los Angeles. That would have given them a pretty good position to dominate the United States, right? Oh, oops, wrong way. Some missiles were already in place when spy planes flying over Cuba brought news that missile sites were being prepared. Then Russian ships were sighted carrying more missiles. What should the president do? The wrong move could start World War III. Both Russia and the United States had weapons that could destroy the world as we know it. What would you do? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, our top military leaders, wanted to bomb Cuba. Kennedy said no to his experts. He would not drop the first bomb, but he did announce that American troops were ready to invade the island if the missiles were not removed. Khrushchev was in a tough spot. 2. Castro wanted the Russians to launch a missile at the United States. Khrushchev said no to that, but he did tell the Russian military experts in Cuba that they could use nuclear weapons if there was an invasion. Kennedy was firm. He said the missiles had to be removed. He gave Khrushchev time to make a decision. Secretly, Kennedy agreed to move US missiles from Turkey. Missiles there were a threat to Russia. For 13 days, the world held its breath, wondering if there would be a nuclear war. Then, the missile-carrying Russian ships turned around and sailed home. The Cuban missiles were removed. The crisis was over. But everyone knew that no one could win a nuclear war. Kennedy wanted both Russia and the United States to sign a treaty to stop testing nuclear bombs. We began talking with Russia about disarmament, reducing or doing away with weapons. Then suddenly, Russia announced that bomb tests would begin again. Those tests put radioactive particles into the atmosphere, and that poisoned the air. Kennedy appealed to the United Nations, but Russia's tests continued. Finally, Kennedy said that the United States would have to begin testing again. Then he made a great speech at American University in Washington. The president said, "Let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. The wave of the future is not the conquest of the world by a single creed, but the liberation of the diverse energies of free nations and free men." He was telling the Russian people that we needed to work together, not continue as enemies. Some Americans couldn't imagine getting along with Russia. Kennedy spoke to them. Some say it is useless to speak of world peace. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war. But we have no more urgent task. We all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. A few weeks later, Khrushchev accepted the US proposal for a test ban treaty. This treaty is particularly for our children and grandchildren, said Kennedy, and they have no lobby in Washington. Meanwhile, things were still a mess in Vietnam. So, there's Nikita Khrushchev toasting the signing of the test ban treaty between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. So that's the story. It came really close. So, do you think JFK did the right thing during the Cuban Missile Crisis, according to the story?